My niche interest is armor, my profession is art, and my love language is rambling, so when the bestie asks me to explain a painting, I deliver. This painting is called Le Chevalier aux Fleurs, or The Knight of the Flowers, and it was painted in 1894 by Georges Rochegros. Before we talk about the story the painting is representing, let's first discuss its place in art history. During the Victorian era, so the latter half of the 19th century and early years of the 20th century, there's a renewed interest in medieval and classical mythology, literature, art, and history. So many artists of this period, including painters and composers, were using those stories as the focal point for their work. In particular, there's a group of English artists that call themselves the Pre-Raphaelites that become very famous for this subject matter. While the group formed based on pretty specific philosophies around art theory and composition, which I won't get into here, they've kind of since become synonymous with this really rich portraiture of women from classical mythology and medieval literature. And they spawn an entire generation of artists who were very influenced by this style, even if they weren't necessarily part of the Brotherhood in name, including, of course, the very famous John William Waterhouse. And that brings us to our boy Georges, who was in fact one of those influenced artists. So this painting is depicting a scene from Arthurian legend, and we gotta get something straight about Arthurian legend, not to Arthur-splain to you, but there are so many versions of who the characters are and what happens in what order. It's kind of like Greek myth in that way. The thing that's important for you to know here is that there's always one knight of the round table who's the purest, most wholesome dude in the land. In later versions of the stories, it's Sir Galahad, but in earlier versions, it's Sir Percival. And that's exactly who we're seeing here in the painting. Because it's only by being the purest, most wholesome dude in the land that you overcome the trials to win the Holy Grail at the end of the story. Anyway, the German composer Richard Wagner, who you know even if you don't know, he wrote Flight of the Valkyries, He writes a musical drama called Parsifal, very loosely based on the Percival myth. A key scene in this drama is that Percival has just smote a bunch of the magical guards around an evil sorcerer's castle, and there's all these, magical flower maidens trying to seduce him. Percival, we're so hot and so alluring. Wouldn't you rather, smang rather than go on your quest? And our boy is I don't know what smanging is, but it doesn't seem as fulfilling as embodying knightly virtues of valor and chastity. I really love how well Rochegros captures that expression of complete innocence and obliviousness. 10 out of 10. And now, of course, we have to talk about our boy's armor. The painting of this is obviously exquisite. The style is obviously not contemporary to what would have been worn in King Arthur's time if King Arthur existed, which is placed around the 5th to 6th century. By contrast, I would kind of clock this as a 15th century Milanese-inspired kit, though the arms aren't quite right. For context, this is what I mean. It's a style that you see a lot in the mid to late 15th century, kind of contemporary to German Gothic, but very distinct from it in that there's not a lot of ornamentation. You have a pretty simple domed cuirass, and then the signature groin and thigh defense called falds, which are composed of lames, which are those horizontal strips of metal that you see from the waist, combined with tassets that hang from the lames. Those are those kind of flappy bits on the thighs. Now this guy's outfitted for cavalry, which you can tell because he has this really oversized left pauldron in anticipation of catching his opponent's lance. And if you look really closely, you'll see that there's some holes underneath his right pauldron, and that's so that he can attach a lance rest. Meanwhile, our Chevalier is very symmetrical, which isn't unheard of. It's just not super typical for this style of armor. And you'll notice that on the right side of his breastplate, he doesn't have those holes for a lance rest, which again is a little bit weird given that armor was often modular in this period. Meaning that if you didn't need the lance rest, you didn't have to attach it, and if you didn't need the big pauldron, you didn't necessarily have to wear it, but you could, and they were kind of designed that you could switch out the parts. You can see that his falds are kind of designed the same way in the historical example. I would shape the tassets a little differently so that they make a little bit more of an arch in the front. And his lames look maybe a little bit chunky. It looks here like maybe he has 3 lames, where in our historical example has 4. And look, I'm not trying to rivet count or anything. It's just that these look a little bit wider than I'm really used to seeing, whereas if you had more of them, they'd look a little bit narrower. But you know what? It's a beautiful painting about a legendary hero, so let's not get too caught up in the details and just admire the artistry.